Good afternoon. I'm Elizabeth Horner. I'm the Director of Education at the Carlos Museum, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's Works on Paper Wednesday program, held in conjunction with an exhibition downstairs in our Works on Paper gallery that was curated by Andy McKenzie in honor of the late Clark Poling, professor and chair of the Art History Department, former director of the Carlos Museum, who passed away in September. And the exhibition recalls the type of exhibition that Clark used to put together for students in Art History 102. And so we think of him today, and we are thrilled beyond belief to have Linda Merrill speak to us today about Whistler and the print in the exhibition. I'm not sure I'm getting the phrase right, but I feel like we're bringing a cannon to a knife fight to have Linda Merrill with us today. She is a renowned scholar of Whistler. She is a senior lecturer in the Art History Department and former curator of American art at both the Freer Gallery in Washington, D.C. and the High Museum here in Atlanta. She's curated multiple exhibitions about Whistler, including After Whistler, the Artist and His Influence on American Painting, which some of you might have seen at the High Museum. Also Whistler and the Haydens, Whistler and the Leylands, Whistler and Japan, Arrangement in Yellow and Gold, paintings by James McNeill Whistler, and most recently, one of the most wonderful exhibitions I've seen in 10 years, The Lost Symphony, Whistler and the Perfection of Art. It wasn't just me who thought that show at the Freer-Sackler was extraordinary. The exhibition received the Global Fine Art Award for the Best Thematic Modern Exhibition of 2016. Linda was also the project director for the conservation and reinstallation of Whistler's Peacock Room, and she initiated the successful effort to furnish the Peacock Room with the Chinese blue and white pottery, as was originally intended by both artist and patron. She is the author of several books and catalogs on Whistler, including After Whistler, the Artist and His Influence on American Painting, The Peacock Room, A Cultural Biography, A Pot of Paint, Aesthetics on Trial in Whistler and Ruskin, and even a children's book, The Princess and the Peacocks, or The Story of the Room. She was co-editor with Lee Glazer on Palaces of Art, Whistler and the Worlds of Aestheticism. She's organized 4 scholarly symposia on the artist, and she's working on 2 Whistler projects right now, one titled The 10 O'Clock Lecture, Whistler and the Performance of Art, and a digital project with the University of Glasgow titled Writing Whistler. So you are in for a treat today. Linda, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you all for coming. I don't know if you're familiar with the Freer Gallery, but it's a small museum at the Smithsonian. It's mostly a museum of Asian art. And in fact, it now is called the National Museum of Asian Art, along with the Arthur M. Sackler Gallery. But it has a select collection of works of American art, including the world's largest and most comprehensive collection of works by Whistler. So I was very fortunate to cut my teeth on that collection. But I got so sick of talking about Whistler that I had to leave. And I came to the High hoping I would never have to say the name again. And of course, I find myself back in Whistler all the time, whether I want to be or not. I want to be today. And it's a real thrill to be able to talk to you for a few minutes about Whistler exclusively and one of his favorite subjects, which is the subject of bridges. Now, it's traditional to begin talks about Whistler with a slide of Whistler's mother, but I instead am showing you a slide of Whistler's father, who was actually a much more consequential person, though he is not as famous today. He was, in his time, an internationally renowned civil engineer. Whistler's early training was at the Royal Academy in St. Petersburg because his father had been commissioned by Tsar Nicholas I to complete the railroad connecting Moscow and St. Petersburg. So it's quite possible that Major Whistler taught his son to look at bridges with a critical eye from an early age. But Whistler, from the beginning, wanted to be an artist. He'd been in St. Petersburg with his parents for a few years when he contracted rheumatic fever and had to go to London to live with his half-sister and recover. And while he was in London, he had a chance to see wonderful art exhibitions and and to study the etchings that were in the collection of his brother-in-law, Seymour Hayden. And all of these experiences solidified, yeah. Solidified his desire to be an artist. So his father was back in St. Petersburg, he was in London, and he wrote to his father, "I hope, dear father, you will not object to my choice, viz. A painter, for I wish to be one so very much, and I don't see why I should not. Many others have done so before. I hope you will say yes in your next, and that dear mother will not object to it." Well, Whistler at the time was 14. And his father told him that it would be okay for him to learn to be an artist as long as he did not become too poetical, as long as his taste did not become too poetical. And he used his art to represent architecture and works of engineering so that he could put his art to some practical purpose. Well, Whistler was never able to do that, and he never lost his very poetical taste. But within a few months, unfortunately, his father in St. Petersburg died from cholera, and Whistler was on his own after that, having to convince his mother that he could make a living as an artist. This is an image of St. Petersburg in the 19th century. It was a very grand, elegant European city, and it's where Whistler got all of his elitist ideas that he never lost. He lived like a little prince on the banks of the Neva in St. Petersburg, and certainly would have enjoyed the view of the bridges there. The next important place that he lived was Paris. As soon as he came into a small inheritance from his father in 1855, he went to Paris to continue his training as an artist. He was well positioned to do that. Having lived in St. Petersburg, he was fluent in French, which put him well ahead of most of the Americans who ended up in Paris at that time. And of course, he enjoyed views of the river and of the bridges in Paris as well. He came under the influence in Paris of Gustave Courbet and the group of artists that surrounded him, and all of them were interested in the ideas of the poet Charles Baudelaire, who wrote in a review of 1859 that he was disappointed that there weren't more modern cityscapes on view. So he wished that he could see more of the landscape of great cities, he said, by which I mean that collection of grandeurs and beauties which results from a powerful agglomeration of men and monuments, the profound and complex charm of a capital city which has grown old and aged in the glories and tribulations of life. So Baudelaire was not interested only in the new Paris that was blooming before his eyes, but also in the old Paris, in the traces of the historic city. And that was something that, that would always influence Whistler in Paris, but especially in London. There we go. So this is an early attempt to create an etching in Paris of the Ile de la Cité, and you can just see, let's see, the red one. Whoops. Oh, there we go. Well, that's in the photograph. There we go. You can just see the towers of Notre Dame to situate yourself. This is not a very good print. Whistler's biographers were very scornful of it. And it seems that Whistler was just experimenting. He hadn't quite mastered the rules of perspective, and he never completed it. But he went on to London and he created this quite lovely view of Old Westminster Bridge. Now, Whistler hardly ever reversed his etchings so that the prints are always backwards. But what you're seeing here is the Houses of Parliament. They were the new Houses of Parliament right here, and Westminster Bridge, an 18th century bridge crossing the Thames. Now this, for Whistler, is a very conventional landscape portrait of the city. There's nothing really very surprising about it. It is interesting that he takes note of the scaffolding and pilings that were holding up Westminster Bridge, which was beginning to fall into a state of collapse. But it was pretty much, he rendered it in pretty much the same way that other Western artists had depicted the bridge. And here's a painting even showing its construction in the 18th century. You can see you've only gotten this far, and these spans are still to be built. So it comes as a real surprise to see this print in 1861, so soon after the picture of the old Westminster Bridge. What he's showing us now is the beginnings of the new bridge. Clearly, what he's interested in is the architecture of the bridge, the bones, the skeleton of the bridge. This is a very rare print. There are only 2 impressions that we know of, and there's nothing else quite like it this early in Whistler's career. So it's a little bit curious from a strange point of view, apparently having more than one perspective on the bridge, very little detail, very little sense of where we are. He portrays the bridge from the Westminster side, which means that Westminster Abbey and the palaces of Westminster, the Palace of Westminster, which are the grand attractions of the bridge, are not even in the picture. So what happened to make him change so dramatically? Well, Japanese prints happened. We know that Whistler had been exposed to Japanese prints when he was a student in Paris. Japan had opened to the West in 1854, and Japanese prints began to be available in export shops in Paris later in the 1850s. And even if Whistler could not afford to buy them, even though they were pretty cheap, but he had virtually no money at that point when he was in Paris, but he certainly would have seen prints that were owned by people he knew. And by the time he got to London, he was able to start to collect them. And we have proof that he had at least one collection of prints by Hiroshige, which we see in this painting, The Golden Screen, that shows a woman, obviously a Western woman, a Victorian woman, though dressed kind of casually in a Japanese kimono, sitting on the floor and looking at this collection of prints. And I just pulled out one of the prints to show you that he's making a pretty good paraphrase of what he's seeing. What's really interesting is how Whistler took his growing reputation as a realist, as a painter of the modern world, whether the scene was beautiful or not, and superimposed that ambition on this interest in Japanese prints. So here we have a work, The Balcony, that he was working on for several years, over several years, 1864 to 70, and he used it as a way to develop his ideas on using Japanese prints or the compositional methods of Japanese prints in his own works. So you see here women disposed on a balcony overlooking a body of water, and on the far side we see Mount Fuji. And Whistler is doing something very similar here, though he's using a portrait orientation for his print of these women on a balcony. He didn't have a balcony, so he made that up. And we think he may have bought some little Japanese dolls that he posed for these women. He probably did have a tea set. He certainly didn't have azalea growing out of his balcony, but he put all of these things together in this beautiful, colorful foreground, and then placed it against this very somber background of the industrial part of London on the other side of the Thames, a part of London that no one would have thought to paint, but it certainly was emblematic of modern London at that time. He's essentially capturing industrial waste and pollution. And he's claiming it as his own by branding it with these little butterflies here. Whistler developed a butterfly monogram, took several different forms from his initials JMW, and began to use that along with the Japanese cartouche as a way to declare his interest in Japanese art. So bridges like balconies were sort of physical liminal spaces dividing water from solid ground and from air. He often used bridges or the lines of bridges as horizon lines. And he was almost certainly looking at a print like this, not necessarily this one. We don't know which ones he had access to. If I perform a little trick and flip the print so that we see it as he drew it on the plate, I think you can see the similarities. What's striking about it is that it's not that big a bridge, but because he has depicted it with this particular curve, it looks like it goes on almost forever. So he wasn't through with Westminster Bridge. He painted this picture the next year in 1862, and interestingly calls it the last of old Westminster, when what it really is a picture of is the new Westminster Bridge, with the scaffolding just being taken down. But just from the title, we know that he was interested primarily in these old timber bridges that crossed the Thames and that were being systematically replaced during the 19th century. He would have recognized the similarities between the city of London, built around a river with timber bridges, and the city of Edo, present day Tokyo, which also was built around these wooden bridges. And he was beginning to identify with Hiroshige in particular, who made a specialty of bridges and water. Oops, I'm going the wrong way. There we go. So what's different about this bridge, the last of old Westminster, is that he painted it from up high, looking down, whereas the previous print was depicted from the ground. So this high viewpoint also is an interesting Japanese technique. He had a friend who lived on the Westminster side of the bridge, and he painted this from the window of his house. So nothing about this painting looks at all Japanese, and yet, like most of Whistler's works in the 1860s, if you compare them to Japanese prints, you can see how he's beginning to change his approach. This is a quintessential realist painting. It's not showing us industrial waste like the balcony, but it is showing us a pretty grimy, gritty scene of the river and the people who work on it. It's a big city, London, and I've circled where we have been here in Westminster Bridge. Here are the Houses of Parliament. But Whistler in the early 1860s, in 1862, moved all the way down the river to Chelsea and became preoccupied with a new bridge, a new old bridge, old Battersea Bridge. And you see it here in a period photograph as taken from the tower of Chelsea Old Church, which is the church that stood at the end of Whistler's Street. It's the church he, like a good boy, good son, took his mother to every Sunday when she came to live with him in Chelsea. You can tell that this is an old timber bridge. It was actually a dangerous bridge. It was very difficult for anything but the narrowest barge to get through. And so even from the early 1860s, when Whistler first became acquainted with it, people were talking about taking it down and replacing it. So he developed a real affection for this bridge. This is the row of houses that he lived in. He lived in two different houses over the course of the 1860s and 70s in this row. And this is before the construction of the Chelsea embankment. The embankment essentially turned the Thames River into a canal by putting very high walls on either side of it. But at this point, it was still just a tidal river. And you can see the boats here that were just outside his window. And the tide would ebb and flow. And so the river looked different all the time. From his window, he had a view of the old Battersea Bridge. Now we're seeing it from the other side now. In another of the works that he painted in the early 1860s, these had been commissioned, these bridge pictures, by a patron in London who was very interested in bridges. But again, it's a very realist view. It's in these somber tonalities of brown and gray, or as he would say, brown and silver. Highly abstract in its approach. He's certainly not trying to aestheticize the view in any way. This is just an interesting detail. What you're seeing here, you can just barely see it on the horizon, is the Crystal Palace, which had been moved from Hyde Park, where it was used for the Great Exhibition in 1851, to a park at Sydenham on the south side of the river. Whistler hated the Crystal Palace. The Crystal Palace stood for everything he despised about Victorian art and culture. And it really annoyed him that on sunny days, the sunshine would glint against the glass of the Silver Palace. And when he looked out his window, he could actually see it. He hated the Crystal Palace, and yet he includes it here just barely in the distance. So again, brown and silver, Old Battersea Bridge is an image of the bridge from up above, from his second-story window looking down. It's a little bit hard sometimes to see why what Whistler was doing was unusual. So I'm showing you here a view by Walter Greaves, who was one of Whistler's pupils. He also was a boatman, so that these boats that were outside Whistler's house belonged to the Greaves family. And Greaves often took Whistler out on the river, and in exchange, Whistler gave him art lessons. And this is his view of Old Battersea Bridge from pretty much the same perspective. And you can see that Greaves is much more caught up in the details of the bridge and much less interested in the tonal atmosphere than Whistler. But then there's another huge change that takes place in Whistler's art between the 1860s and the early 1870s. And that's the development of the Nocturne, which is Whistler's signal contribution to Western art. There's no parallel for it in Western art. It seemed to come out of nowhere, and it was very puzzling to the people of his time. So where did he get the idea for the Nocturne? A nocturne basically is, well, as he described it, an arrangement of line, form, and color. He really did see it as a formal genre of art. He was inspired by the River Thames at night and sometimes in the early morning when the river was quiet. The river was really noisy and very dirty and very active during the day. So the only time he could go out on it was at night. It's interesting to think that Whistler is painting these at the same time that the Impressionists are developing Impressionism in France. And Whistler was in fact invited to exhibit with them at the first Impressionist exhibition in 1874. He was invited by Degas, but he declined and had a solo exhibition in London instead, which was pretty typical. Whistler was not a joiner. But he did want to show off this new genre that he had created. And he made about a dozen of these paintings, all in variations of blue and silver and gold and sometimes green. And of course, he got that idea too from Japanese art. He was fascinated by Japanese prints and how different they looked depending on the color scheme and the way that they were printed. Whistler was a master printer, and he printed his own etchings, which was unusual at the time. So he would have paid close attention to these woodblock prints. This is one, we know that he owned an impression of this print, so it was obviously important to him, but he surely had seen it in many variations, and that could have, probably did, give him the idea for a nocturne. And this print is showing a bridge from a completely different point of view from down below. And this is the print that probably inspired the even more radical nocturne blue and gold Old Battersea Bridge. So this is Whistler's most radical view of this bridge. A lot of people didn't understand it. I'm showing you this just because I just found it last week, which is, I think, a really beautiful actual Japanese print from 1915 that is inspired by Whistler's Nocturne, as it says on the back, so that the influence is nicely reciprocal. But Nocturne Blue and Gold, which had been purchased and was in a private collection, went on view at a new exhibition venue called the Grosvenor Gallery that opened in 1877. Artists showed there by invitation. They could show any works they wanted once they were invited, which meant that they were free to show some of their most radical works. And Whistler lived up to that with these two nocturnes, among some other works, but these were certainly his most abstract works to date. The Nocturne in black and gold, The Falling Rocket, does not have a bridge in it. It is a scene that takes place at an amusement park, but obviously the fireworks, even the idea to paint fireworks, which people thought was absolutely ridiculous, that would have come from the Japanese prints that we've seen. Oscar Wilde had been suspended from Oxford University for a little while in 1877, and so he needed something to do. So he decided to become an art critic and went to London and attended the inaugural exhibition of the Grosvenor Gallery and said, "These pictures are certainly worth looking at for about as long as one looks at a real rocket, that is, for somewhat less than a quarter of a minute." Whistler probably never knew about this review, but he certainly knew about the review by John Ruskin, who was one of Wilde's teachers. Ruskin said, among other things, "I have seen and heard much of Cockney impudence before now, but never expected to hear a coxcomb ask 200 guineas for flinging a pot of paint in the public space." Eloquent, but not a very nice thing to say. It's what a lot of people were thinking. The idea of throwing a pot of paint certainly is a descriptor for this painting, which looked to a lot of people like Whistler had just taken his brush and flung bits of pigment on the canvas. It was really very serious, though, because Ruskin was such an important figure in 19th century Britain. His influence was just beginning to wane just a little bit, but until this time, he was the arbiter of taste in Victorian Britain. And so when Whistler saw this critique, he knew that he would not be able to sell his works again, that nobody was going to go against Ruskin, and that it was quite possible that his career would be over if he couldn't do something to stop it. Part of the reason he was in a difficult position at that time was because of the Peacock Room, which was a decoration he had begun in 1876 when he was just helping out a friend, his friend Thomas Jekyll, who was responsible for the design of the room. And Whistler had nothing to do with the interior architecture, all of these little spindle shelves and the sideboard and the shutters, all of that was designed by Thomas Jekyll for the patron, Frederick R. Leyland, who owned this enormous collection of blue and white porcelain and wanted to create a dining room that was like a European porcelain room. Jekyll, in the process of designing the room, fell into a manic condition. He was bipolar and had to be institutionalized and never came out of the hospital. And so Whistler was brought in to just finish up what Jekyll had begun. And that really is what he did for several months. And then when Leyland came back and saw what he'd done, he didn't like it. It didn't look like this yet. There was a lot of gold, and Leyland thought that it was immodest and refused to pay Whistler the full amount that Whistler thought he had earned, which was 2,000 guineas. Leyland said he would pay him 1,000 guineas, and Whistler accepted on the condition that he be able to remain in the room and finish it to his satisfaction. And what he did was to paint over the beautiful antique leather hangings in Prussian blue, and then he painted this mural on the south wall of what he called the rich peacock and the poor peacock, which represented Leyland here with his feathers ruffled, and Whistler, this poor put upon peacock here. The coins that he didn't earn are around his feet. So the Peacock Room was another instance of his losing money. He had spent a lot of time in the room, not producing any other work and earning only half of what he thought he had deserved. And Leyland not only didn't pay him what he should have paid him, but he started sending him bills for heating bills and bills for gold leaf and everything else that Whistler had used in the room. He was also in trouble because he was building a house. He had never owned a house before, but he had commissioned his friend E.W. Godwin to design a studio house that he was going to use to train students. And then he thought through teaching, he could make some money. But we all know that when you start to build a house, the costs mount all the time. This is what the house ended up looking like. And Whistler got to live in it for less than a year. So he really felt that he had no choice but to take Ruskin to court. This is the courtroom. It's much earlier than when Whistler was in it, but it's in the old Westminster Hall, which is the only medieval structure that remains next to the Houses of Parliament. And when the Ruskin trial took place, it was very, very crowded and hot and dim. And the trial took place at the end of November. And if you have ever been in London in the end of November, you know there is no light. And there was no light, and the paintings were brought in as exhibits. And of course, nobody could see them at all. So this is just to show how little people understood what Whistler was doing. The lawyer on the other side said, well, what was the subject of this nocturne? And Whistler said, a moonlight effect on the river near old Battersea Bridge. So he was making a point that the bridge was not the subject of the painting, that it was an effect that he was creating through his art. So Baron Huddleston is the judge, and he says which part of the picture is the bridge. And of course, everybody laughed. And Whistler felt that he then had to explain to the judge what he was looking at. Do you say that this is a correct representation of the bridge? And this was a key question. Whistler said, I did not intend it to be a correct portrait of the bridge. It is only a moonlight scene. And the pier in the center of the picture may not be like the piers at Battersea Bridge as you know them in broad daylight. As to what the picture represents, that depends upon who looks at it. To some people, it may represent all that is intended. To others, it may represent nothing. So Whistler was throwing out to the court the idea of ambiguity, of poetic ambiguity, that the painting could be read different ways, that it wasn't a portrait, it wasn't a true representation of a bridge, it was a suggestion, and it was a suggestion on his mind that came through moonlight, and as we now know, through the influence of Japanese prints. He superimposed his memory of these moonlight scenes on his understanding of Japanese art. So it went on and on, these questions. Is that a barge beneath? Yes, I'm very encouraged in your perceiving that. My whole scheme was to bring about a certain harmony of color. And then he asked him about the falling rocket, which I hope you can see right here. Later in the trial, the Attorney General, who was on Ruskin's side of the court, said that this looked like a telescope. And the fact is, it kind of does look like a telescope if you don't know what you're looking at. But the audience in the court was not willing to give Whistler the benefit of the doubt, and neither was the jury. They did award him a farthing in damages for Ruskin's libel, so that he did win a victory, but a farthing is 1/4 cent. So it did nothing to help his financial plight. He didn't know what he was going to do. He had absolutely no money, no cash at all. He owed everybody in London. He couldn't even go to his greengrocer anymore. And one day he saw his old friend, Charles Augustus Howell, walking down the street. Howell had been the private secretary of Ruskin, but he had also been a friend of Whistler from time to time. And it was Howell's idea that Whistler begin to print again, that his paintings weren't going to sell, but he still had a reputation as an etcher, and he should get back to work making etchings. So he did. And this is one of the first that he made in the wake of the Ruskin trial, called the Adam and Eve Old Chelsea. And it's quite a remarkable print because the Adam and Eve no longer existed when he made this print. It is the one and only etching he made based on a reconstruction from period photographs, including this one. So he realized that there probably was a market for these vanishing views of Chelsea. This is just when things were beginning to be torn down so that the embankment could be constructed. And he printed 100 of these. They were very popular. They're also highly detailed and finished in a way that Whistler really hadn't etched since his very early years in London. But it gave him an idea to depict these vanishing views of London. And of course, he wanted to focus on bridges. So here's his favorite bridge, Old Battersea Bridge, in a much more popularly accessible view than what we saw in the Nocturne. He knew that this would be recognizable. It still has the feel of Japanese art, and yet it also can be seen as a fairly straightforward depiction of this kind of rickety wooden bridge here with a sailboat underneath. So he began to etch these plates and even to print them in 1879. Here's a possible reference for him, another Hiroshige print. And then he turned his vision to Old Putney Bridge, which was a little bit farther up the river. It was even older and ricketier than Old Battersea Bridge, and Whistler had not paid a lot of attention to it in the past. But beginning in 1864, people were talking about replacing this bridge, which was the oldest wooden bridge on the Thames. And so he could be pretty sure that it would not be around for much longer, and he wanted to appeal to the people who loved the history of the Thames and loved this vanishing landscape. So he created this, this view. This is a quotation from 1884, letter in 1884, but I think it's pretty typical of what people were saying about the bridge at the time. This writer was objecting to the fact that certain antiquarians were objecting to taking down the old bridge and replacing it with a modern stone bridge. As a matter of fact, he says, Old Putney Bridge is one of the dirtiest, most dangerous, and least picturesque on the river. It has not a single curve or line of beauty throughout its great length. It is unsightly and rickety, and its removal will be a great benefit, as well as a decided artistic advantage. Never have antiquarian sentiment shown its lack of utilitarianism so conspicuously as it has done in this instance. So there were the people who were arguing to keep the bridge and the people who said that it was an eyesore and had to go. And they were the ones who won out in the end. So it's an interesting example of Whistler's work because you can tell that he's really trying to create something that's going to be popular and that's going to sell. So it's full of incident in a way that's very unusual for Whistler. He has all of there's always a little bit of pedestrian traffic on his bridges, but he has quite a lot. And this bridge had all sorts of notices up that if your load was very heavy, you shouldn't go across the bridge because it might not be able to support you. So he even has a rather large horse-driven carriage up there. And then in the foreground, he has a man and a woman in a sailboat and in a boat, and next to it, another boat that must be the one that he is in as he is making this drawing from down below looking up. So like Hiroshige, he is trying to lend monumentality to this bridge from the angle, from the perspective that he's drawing it from. And there's some irony there, since there was nothing monumental about this bridge. It was the most ramshackle, rickety bridge in London. And in fact, the Fine Arts Society in London had begun to buy Whistler's plates, but they wouldn't buy this one because they didn't like Old Putney Bridge. Later changed their mind. I'm sorry. Here we go. So this is just to show you the way Old Putney Bridge had been depicted in the past. This one in the 18th century when it still looks pretty good. It was brand new. It was a toll bridge, so there were these toll houses on either end of the bridge. Here's a photograph probably taken soon before it was taken down. One of the features of the bridge is that there was a church on either side of it, and that's highly unusual to have on a main river churches on either side of a bridge. But here are some Victorian gentlemen looking out over the bridge, and this appears to be one of the few times, I think there were only 3 or 4 times, when the Thames froze, so people could walk across the bridge, saving themselves that toll. And then here is a later painting in the realist vein from the Wandsworth or the Fulham side of the bridge. And you can see that it's a bridge with an unusual design. It has, it's constructed with these V's projecting out into the river. And that was so that if you were walking across and a carriage came, because it was a narrow bridge, you could get out of the way by stepping into one of these little V's, and the carriage wouldn't run you down or splash you or whatever. And finally, this is a sketch that was drawn for the publication called The Builder. And this person had himself sat in a boat and had himself moored to the edge of the bridge. And I think he probably got this idea of drawing the bridge from this perspective, which hardly anybody ever saw. He probably learned that trick from Whistler and that old Putney Bridge. So then where did this one come from? Finally, we're to Little Putney Bridge, or the Little Putney #1, as it's sometimes called. And this is the print in Emery's collection. It's really interesting because Whistler's taken a completely different approach, as though he tried to be very anecdotal and incidental in Old Putney Bridge, and he really wasn't satisfied with that approach to the bridge. So he tried something that was much more like his usual style, which is very reductive, to show the bridge from a distance, to play up its delicacy. He didn't mind that it was rickety. He kind of liked that about this bridge. But it's as though the dislike people had for Putney Bridge was a challenge to him, that he wanted to make it beautiful, even though everybody else hated it. So here is the impression that we have downstairs. When the print went to the Athenaeum for the Athenaeum reviewer, he said the first, which is this one, although but a very slight and telling sketch, is marked by the delicate and brilliant feeling of the artist for the elements of his subject, the varying solidities of the bridge and its reflections on the water, which I think is a very astute review of this little print. So during the time that Whistler was making these etchings and printing these etchings from a printing press he borrowed and set up in the White House, his house was full of bailiffs, the legal representatives who were there to make sure that he didn't abscond with any of his assets, because they all had to be sold to pay off his creditors. But Whistler managed to hide those copper plates. I don't know how he did it, but he kept them out of the hands of the bailiffs so that he could get at least a little money from the prints. There weren't enough impressions printed of any of these plates for him to have made enough money, but maybe he could at least pay off the greengrocer or the fishmonger so that he could eat. But as you see from this poster, everything was sold on May the 19th, 1879, when he was finally declared bankrupt, and his house also, the White House, had to be sold. And the only positive thing to come out of this is that he got a commission to go to Venice to create a set of etchings. And this is one of the Venice etchings. And you can see that he is continuing with his preoccupation with bridges. Now, just before I stop, I want to show you how this plate evolved. People say about this that he was in a big hurry because he was hiding the plates from his creditors, and so he didn't reverse it. And consequently, everything was on the wrong side of the river. This really annoyed the critics, that everything was on the wrong side of the river. But Whistler hardly ever reversed his plates, which is to say he didn't make a drawing and then set the drawing up in front of a mirror and etch what he saw in the mirror. Because for Whistler, the specifics of the subject matter didn't matter as much as the aesthetic effect of the whole. But we do know that he was poor when he started this, because you can tell he's reusing an old plate. There's the suggestion of an earlier etching there, which was then burnished out in this second state of the etching. And then in the third etching, the third state, he adds his butterfly here quite prominently. One way we can date these things is by the style of the butterfly, which changed over the course of his life. And he also had a habit of signing on the sheet outside the plate. And so Whistler prints often appear like this, so that they have to be floated on the mat so that we can see that second butterfly. This is the print in the Freer collection. This is the fourth state, which I'm pretty sure is the state that we have downstairs. You can still see the butterfly, but just barely. It's faded almost away. And he's changed some of the details. If you look back here, if you look underneath, he's changed some of the details underneath the bridge. And then finally, the fifth state was published in a book called Four Masters of Etching by Frederick Wedmore, who was a great scholar of etching, Whistler couldn't stand him. Whistler didn't like most art critics. And so Wedmore had endured a lot of ridicule from Whistler, and yet he had the good sense to make Whistler one of the 4 masters of etching and to include, to buy the plate and to include this in his book. And the reason, he said, was, I thought, I didn't know I had the power to do that. I should have done that a long time ago. I thought it gave extraordinarily in its considered slightness the sense of spaciousness and sunshine. The spaciousness I had seen, the sunshine was a new idea to me, but when he burnished out the clouds in an early impression, maybe that's what he was meaning to say, was that the sunshine was coming out on the Thames. Oops. Well, there is one more. I was just going to show you a print of, a picture of Putney Bridge as it appears today. Do you know what the issue is? It's weird. There we go. There we go. So old Putney Bridge was replaced with this Putney Bridge. Huh, who knew? All right, thank you very much.
Thank you. That was amazing. And I'm going to just open up the chat and see if there are any questions. The Q&A, if you have a question, if you're on Zoom and you'd like to post a question, please do. And we can also take questions in the room if there are any.
Coming late, Linda, that was really great. And I noticed that both reviewers of the Etchings, the Athenaeum reviewer and then Wedmore, use the word slight or slightly, but they use it as a term of approbation. Whereas in the court case, slightness of representational finish is used as a term of disapprobation. And I'm curious to know why it is that when people talk about the etchings, slight becomes positive, and when they talk about the paintings, slight becomes negative. And whether these critics, Wedmore and the Athenaeum critic, were in fact mounting a kind of pro-Whistler campaign against Ruskin and Ruskin supporters. It was a kind of implicit campaign on behalf of Whistler.
That's very interesting. I mean, it's certainly possible that they were. There were a lot of people who felt that Ruskin had had his day and it was time for him to retire gracefully and let somebody else come onto the scene. It was not possible, though, for Whistler to raise any funds to pay costs of the trial, whereas Ruskin very easily got support. He could have afforded it, but he got supporters to pay his cost. As for the difference in painting and etching, I think the slightness in the etching just has to do with the delicacy of the touch, these very fine needles that he liked to use. And people were impressed that he could convey so much with such economy of means, so few lines and so slight, that was seen as a great asset of his etchings. But with paintings, they wanted something more substantial, partly because they cost a lot more. And that was Ruskin's complaint, was the cost of the painting, which he had no right to criticize. So the whole idea of value for money was very important to the Victorians, and they felt that in the paintings they weren't getting what they paid for. But in the etching, sometimes the slighter, the better.
Was 200 guineas really the price of the painting?
Yeah, it really was.
A ton of money.
It was a ton of money. But he had gotten that for paintings before, or certainly close to that from private patrons. So it wasn't totally out of the realm of possibility. And this was at a time when Victorian painters were celebrities and they were earning thousands and thousands of pounds and living in palaces. So art was expensive in the Victorian period, and Whistler was not up there at the top by any means.
A question from Zoom, our Zoom audience. The etching of Little Putney Bridge resembles stylistically a Renaissance era sketch, in my opinion. Am I wrong? Is this a coincidence or a one-off? Do any of Whistler's other etchings or drawings have this quality?
I hadn't thought about that. Walter, what do you think?
I mean, whether it's Renaissance era, I don't know, but it definitely is a sketch-like. I mean, it's a sketch that purports to be a finished picture. It is true. I think the person who poses the question, Marie-Claire Tan, it is true that in the 16th century, early 16th century, that's when sketch-like drawings begin to circulate. Works that can be appreciated as finished works, even though they are sketch-like. And these etchings are in that tradition.
Well, and people would have said that all Whistler's work was in that tradition. That was their complaint with him, was that he was exhibiting sketches as finished paintings, especially his portraits, except for the portrait of his mother. Nobody ever said that about her. But other portraits they felt were very sketch-like, and that he needed to take them back to the studio and just paint on them a little bit more until he could finish them. So, but I think the aspect of sketchiness is appealing in an etching, because it's meant to be a sketch. It's meant to be like a drawing. It is a drawing in a way.
Any other questions? Linda, I can't thank you enough for a splendid afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
so much.
I'm sorry about that little